My name is Michael Dexter, and I will be talking about, by the numbers, ZFS performance results from 6 operating systems and their derivatives. It is great to be back at BBSDCon, and there is a sub-theme to all of this, which is stop losing data. Thank you, Alan, for giving a very good overview of the caching architecture of ZFS, and there have been several talks and will be additional talks about the technology, so I won't go too deep into the weeds on the technical aspects. I can say I love ZFS, but it was definitely not love at first sight. So we met at V15 many years ago, and back then, as you may recall, RAID-Z planning was rather complex. You need to get the precise number of disks for the right layout, or you may be penalized in a number of ways. If you lost your write log, your slog device, back then a rather expensive, fragile, borderline experimental SSD flash device, you'd lose your pool, which was a bit disconcerting. And to quote Josh Petzel, you want 16 gigs more RAM than you currently have. But then finally, as time went on, we both grew. LZ4 compression helped with the RAID-Z planning, and Matt Ahrens has a great article about how I stopped worrying about RAID-Z and love RAID-Z. It's a great one you can find pretty easily. And come V28, the pretty much universal version of ZFS between OpenSolaris and Solaris, the slog would fail gracefully. That was good. And then commodity hardware caught up quite nicely with ZFS, and even here and now, used commodity hardware is rather competent with ZFS, and that'll be a bit of a theme also in this. So having seen ZFS in the wild for some time, I am still convinced that it is a set of logical conclusions, and if you were to start fresh with a really large budget, clean room, you would still follow many of its strategies. And pretty revolutionary back in the day was relying on the CPU for things like checksumming, compression, and encryption. Back in the day when Kirk and company were writing early file systems, fast file systems, they had to find ways to not keep the CPU busy. They needed to minimize everything they did. But now we have resources that are somewhat plentiful, which is great. And you can generally spook people using other file systems by mentioning their file system and petabyte in the same sentence. So when you say petabyte, it's like, oh no, how do we scale up foo file system to that? And the fact that ZFS is taking virtual devices, VDEVs, which provide redundancy, and striping them as you grow, you, for the most part, increase performance as you grow in capacity, which is generally not the case with most file systems. That's brilliant. And I'm sure you've heard in other talks, and we'll hear furthermore about copy on write, the fact that it's a very linear, log-oriented file system as needed. That allows for things like snapshots, rollback, and replication. In the era of ransomware, things like rollback and even cloning for forensics. So you have a state of the bad situation preserved off, yet you're back in business. It's just unrivaled. And a touch on replication. Dan, I know you love tape. I get that. Are there other tape fans in the room? I've heard horror stories of people having libraries of tapes, and when it came time to try one and restore something, not one was valid, be it for different changes in firmware, drivers, you name it, between the vendor as OSs evolved, etc. But with ZFS, you have the opportunity for continuous data validation in the form of validating a checksum when you read data and validating it at rest through a scrub periodically as you see fit. And by relying on copy on write and snapshots for replication, your backup, it's a backup when it's a backup, your duplicate of your data is block for block identical to the source. And it's generally online and available. And if you want to verify that what you think you have backed up is backed up, you can very easily go check and say, there it is, excellent. All these snapshots made their way over, and if there are multiple copies of them, we know we have multiple copies of the exact same data, and that is revolutionary. And there is internally various atomic database-like validation that everything happens in sequence, and if you lose power, you do not lose everything. So That's critical because you have a job to do. I'm sure everyone, there are a few developers here who's a bit meta to all of it, but we all have things to deliver. We have services to provide. We have users to keep happy. And I observe there are fewer and fewer single platform organizations. Back in the day, oh, we're an IBM shop, or an Apple shop back when they had enterprise products. We're a Windows shop. It's like, well, you're a Windows shop, so you have Android on site. Well, yes, we have a few Macs. We're using AWS, and I suppose you could really try to be all one ecosystem, but I suggest you make the best of all available. So we have ecosystems, not monocultures. And now that Windows doesn't do phones, you couldn't even get away with a full infrastructure that's strictly one vendor. Now, often that's by choice. Most tech companies I hear from give you a choice of the Linux box, the Windows box, or the Mac, and just go connect to the VPN and do what you have to do. Now, occasionally that's by mandate. And putting the V in VBSDCon, our hosts VeriSign have demonstrated the importance of operating dual stack under mandate to protect, say, the safety and continuity of the internet. Because if you were to maintain a monoculture in every regard across a vast infrastructure like they maintain, then you could be brought down by one single issue and all of that. So thank you for demonstrating that there's always a case to diversify, even if you think you have a nice dialed-in solution. So here and now, as you probably all know, ZFS started in Solaris back at Oracle and became OpenSolaris, and back at Sun back in the day, Oracle acquired Sun, and it's off in its own world with their own branch of it. But out of that came OpenZFS, and that's primarily meant Illumos. That's meant early on FreeBSD. That's handled it very well. And gradually GNU Linux, macOS, Windows, and NetBSD, which is quite the coverage at this point. Now, I'm finding that Oracle ZFS is surprisingly different. Certain things that should have worked, like a send between two V28 pools, did not work. I'll touch on that later, but Oracle ZFS is a very different thing. The knowledge you have maintaining it will apply everywhere, which is great. But for those with hoping to have a perfect mix of OpenZFS and ZFS from Oracle, may have challenges. But as I see it, OpenZFS with that coverage is becoming a bit like the TCP/IP, POSIX, or OpenSSH of file systems. There are always risks in monocultures, but there is strength in the standards that these represent. TCP is not an implementation, it's a standard. POSIX is a standard, and of course there are countless, not always compatible implementations of it. And for better or for worse, OpenSSH is very much a monopoly on that area, but there is Mosh and other tools out there that implement much of the protocol, etc. And it's best to follow the rules before breaking the rules. So I think it's very exciting that we're bringing OpenZFS gradually up to the same level on a very diverse set of platforms. In my day job, I effectively have an OpenZFS crisis line, primarily FreeNAS and FreeBSD related, but that does extend into GNU Linux occasionally and other platforms. I've been using ZFS for, since 2013. That was a V28 implementation, not necessarily open source, provided as a nice bundled up commercial app on Macintosh. It has not hiccuped, and it's transitioned nicely to OpenZFS. I was the first to run OpenZFS on real hardware and provide the first share off of it. It's been great to work with Jorgen, and I'll get more into that later. So when I say call for testing, yes, it's up to all of us to pound on these technologies and platforms, especially if you have domain knowledge, such as those who know a lot more about Windows in this room than I do, and many of us Unix geeks, because we really can't have a second-class OpenZFS platform. If there is like the one of 6 that loses data, the headline will trump everything else, and we all look bad. So it is, I'd argue, pretty critical that NetBSD be a good first-class player along with Windows, along with FreeBSD, along with Illumos, et cetera, because without that, we will all suffer. So a bit about the lab. I touched on commodity hardware finally catching up with the demands of ZFS. On a shoestring budget, I have been building a lab of HPZ workstations, small form factor Xeon machines. Is everyone familiar with the HPZ? That's a good thing for all of us because they are very familiar to engineers and architects, and my doctor had one of these under his desk, and they're very vertical market oriented. They are very free software friendly. They have Intel networking. They shipped with Linux. They shipped with, I believe, FreeDOS was an option. So suddenly, the operating systems that brought us all here today run really well on them. And because they are niche machines that happen to be great for, say, graphics, the gamers haven't really discovered them, despite the fact that they're very suitable for gaming and perhaps Plex Media and you name it. They're quiet, they're durable, and because people don't understand them, they're cheap. So acquiring 11 of them, one's a service machine, was not very expensive, all things considered. And I'm very glad that maybe taxpayer dollars or engineering dollars paid all that depreciation originally, and I got it cheap. Thank you, ARM, for donating an ARM64 system. The Overdrive 1000, very popular among the BSDs for building packages, you name it. There are several in Theo's basement. The NetBSD folks use them. The Zen people use them. Good machines. And straightforward, it might be discontinued, which is tragic. Good little machine. For those who caught any of this in Tokyo or Ottawa, first generation, I was using 500 gig, 7200 RPM drives. They run hot. That requires lots of fan cooling, and that produces lots of noise. And that drove everyone involved nuts. So I'll touch on how that's been improved. I was relying on Cygwin rather than PowerShell. I'll get to more on that. And Triplic's a very fascinating Illumos variant that's just straightforward, very OpenBSD-like. Doesn't have beehive such that it's not super interesting to me in the long term, but it may eventually. But OmniOS CE has been following SmartOS and Joyent's beehive development. So that's a fascinating platform. I spent a minute or two with those technologies. Methodology 1.0, SSH is your friend. In all of this, it's one of the most reliable available tools across platforms, especially in Windows nowadays. It's included in base. You can add it as a feature as a server, enable it, and off you go. However, when it comes to all those familiar tools that many of the people in the room have used for 20, 30 years, longer at times, wow, how is it that we have more OpenZFS portability than like tree utility or RealPath or all these really primitive utilities that don't do a whole lot, but somehow they are just not universally available. And I would love to see a portable BSD userland equivalent to the GNU userland. It's been out there technically, but it's always been affiliated with a kernel at times, and oh, I can dream. And wow, so okay, one can afford $20 SSDs in this day and age, and they're quite good, and it's saved a lot on noise, which was great. But come for the silence and stay for the reporting. SSDs generally report you the LBAs written. And if you're ever performance bench testing, it often comes down to start seconds timestamp, stop seconds timestamp, subtracting the two, and blocks when you started, blocks when you finished, and subtracting the two and just getting two numbers. And it's not glorious, but that's what it looks like. Same with network, benching, et cetera. So that's quite exciting in the long term. OpenSSH stays in charge of just getting from one OS to another instantly, and then hoping that the various command lines, notably, obviously, binsh and PowerShell, play nicely. And the most coverage I could find across these OSs was the FIO flexible I/O tester. IOZone has licensing issues. It's not available on certain platforms. It's available on Solaris, but not Debian and that sort of thing. And like, okay. Again, the file system's more portable than some of the tools, and then there are build issues, and then certain OSs don't ship with compilers and all that fun stuff you get to deal with. SmartMon Tools is not unlike OpenSSH, the universal tool that everyone uses. Chuck Tuffley and I have worked on Smart, and hopefully that will get integrated in all this, because often it's that one value that you want. It's not, you want the whole lifestyle. You don't want what I'd argue are not too useful reporting, like the global smart status. I consider that the OMD status on my desk, where I'm looking for the warranty information, because I know it's dead. Yes, thank you. But how it's performing over time is interesting. During the summer, temperature is very, very important. And a lot of people ship their servers with like the nice cool fan setting. And they start dropping drives. And it's like free of charge to go into BIOS and kick up the fans and drop them from like 40 degrees to 30 degrees. Do it. Save yourself some money. You paid for that hardware. Enjoy it. I've seen it. And then again, things like BinSH versus PowerShell, which very different worlds, but remarkably compatible, and you just have to wrap your head around the fact that one is very linear and functional and one is object-oriented. And I'll have some thanks for those who have helped out with that. So currently, in the lab, I am using macOS Mojave. I'm an OS CE, Windows 10, CentOS 7, NetBSD, just about NetBSD 9. Watch for that announcement. Listen to BSD Now and listen for the announcement on NetBSD 9. It should be here within weeks, months. It's looking good. And it's made very good progress on the ZFS front since even snapshots a few months ago. Debian 10, ZFS on Linux on FreeBSD 12. There are snapshots out of the TrueOS folks. There is FreeNAS 11.2, which is a rather popular operating system that I'd argue has put ZFS in the hands of more people than anyone in ways that even Sun could have never imagined. And FreeBSD 12 on that ARM64 machine. In the lab, but not yet in the mix, are HP Z420 systems. Xeon 1605s maybe? They cost less than the Xeon E3 small form factors. Go figure. They are generally purchased in bulk. They are sold in bulk. They're affordable. They're powerful. They're quick. They're very affordable, like down to $80 each. Affordable. Again, I thank and pity the person who paid the full retail on that, because I'm paying like 5% of it. And we can all benefit from such things. So one's running FreeBSD Beehive for obvious reasons. Hopefully one will be on Zen. Hyper-V is an interesting solution. That should actually say Hyper-V Core. People familiar with that? Nod, no, yes, no. I'll touch more on some of the opportunities there. XCPNG, the name is not super obvious, but it's a fully open source distribution of Zen Server. It has a rather healthy community. They aren't very noisy, but that's often good in these circles. It's a rather competent piece of software. And Proxmox, which of all the Linux systems I've touched, has root on ZFS out of the box. That's a hot topic that I will not be going too deep in today, but they pulled it off. There it is. There might be licensing issues. That is way above my pay grade. In the future, I did briefly have SmartOS, but it's a unique beast in how you install it. I'm very pleased with their Beehive work. It's rather popular, despite also not having a noisy community. It's definitely a thing, even off of their own cloud. Oh, Ubuntu, they have made promises about root on ZFS. That should be here within the next few months. That's pretty cool. NetBSD Zen, that treated me extremely well about 8 years ago? No, 10 years ago? It just worked. It was long before the hardware assistance, before VirtIO drivers were everywhere, but wow, it was a stable platform, and I think it should get a little more attention. I am not clear if there are GNU Linux distributions shipping ARM64 builds of OpenZFS, but that's quite compelling because there's a wonderful ecosystem of small boards that support ARM64. Proper Windows server at some point. I was joking with Lucas earlier that the Microsoft Exchange on OpenZFS Mastery book will be paying for a housing upgrade in the future, but we're not there yet. So the FreeBSD factor. There is FreeBSD 11, 12 current at this very moment, and I'd say and argue there is FreeBSD 11, stable 12, stable Zen, and Zen current, and I hope to move to net booting to repurpose the NetBoot-friendly OSs. There's a very, even in 2019, there's a very distinct difference between a DOS, a disk operating system, be it all the Windows products, be it FreeNAS, be it macOS, and then the network-friendly ones, which is virtually everything else there. So if a bank of machines can be repurposed and even validated with one OS and kept, verified that they're acting pretty similarly, and then have another OS drop on them using the same available drives on the machine, great. But I'm not there yet. And naturally, there's the whole art and science of benchmarking versus stress testing. The more mature platforms like Illumos and arguably GNU Linux and definitely FreeBSD are certainly candidates for proper benchmarking and comparisons. As for new platforms like Windows and NetBSD, it's been early on, it was like, well, throw Crystal Disk Mark, throw a bunch of directory creation as random stuff at it and watch it panic. And go learn to read Windows crash dumps and retrieve them and hand them over to jargon and that kind of thing. So there are different needs at different points. Throughout all this, I'm not super hung up on performance per se, but I was impressed with what came out of everything. I'll get to that shortly. And in general, this is uncharted territory. It's like I spent quite some time trying to figure out how my extremely simple touch script would fail. And well, no, OpenZFS on Windows was not yet supporting touch, and that had to be fixed. And you just have to go in assuming nothing. And how could a RAM upgrade brick a motherboard? Well, it's a known issue, but fortunately those motherboards are rather affordable at this point, $17. Yay, that's fixed. And wow, you'd think portable software is indeed portable, but again, it's more impressive that there's OpenZFS on more places than the simple Unix utilities that I'm hoping to use in simple operations. So I focused on consistency as much as I can within the different nuances on different OSs, and again, assume nothing as you're going into this. And on early days technologies like this, be it notably Windows and NetBSD support, it's always the tip of the iceberg. This is a flashback experience to my work with Beehive, where it was undocumented, it was experimental, it will burn your fingers, but eventually, with enough insane volunteers, it'll get somewhere. I've kept things very simple on Z-pools, notably disabling compression, because who knows, there might be OS advantages by the way they're handling something, by handing off to the CPU otherwise, that may taint the results. 8 times a pretty minor one, and the most notable change I've made in different tests is just sync forced at the file system level, or standard just asynchronous. Naturally, in the workload level, I also went with the option of sync or no sync, which is a very long way to proper benchmark simulation, touching on Benedict's talk, touching on Alan's talk, on what say, I think it's a Sysbench would look like, to have a proper database spin up on this. I personally am a long way from there, but I want to get these platforms like Windows and NetBSD up to speed to begin to have that conversation. For FIO, pretty straightforward. I've stayed with a rather native block size, which made a big difference and kept it consistent. And 8 gigs in size specifically to make sure we're at least blowing most buffers on an 8 gig piece of hardware. Random rewrite, I go into these specifically. Random rewrite, insist on non-buffered I/O. Nothing too exotic there, and the key is more consistency than tuning, per se. So some numbers. Right off the bat, and keep in mind, this is the Z-pool syncing always, which you quote-unquote never want to do, but when testing the lowest level performance of it, I'd argue you want to do. And then having the FIO utility insist on sync always. So the Windows ones didn't perform super well, but that's an experimental technology. I was surprised by CentOS there. FreeNAS relatively low there, but it's also back on FreeBSD 11.2, and we'll touch real soon on how things are improving. And working our way up, Windows 10 did surprisingly better. NetBSD did surprisingly well for a rather beta platform. ARM64 did remarkably well. Debian 10 native, and this is its own ext2. The FIO is broken on Debian at the moment, so it's not even in the mix. And rather impressively, ZFS on Linux on ZFS in its beta form, it's out for testing, and I'm sure they're still wrapping up some issues. It did very well. So we're seeing generationally a span between, say, the FreeBSD 11 that FreeNAS is based on for the stable branch versus the development work being done. And as we jump into asynchronous, we get more to a real-world workload where NetBSD did okay, macOS did okay, although there are some issues on macOS where it'll start well and drop off, and I'll work with Jorgen on trying to pin that down. On OSs where I'm obviously booting root on ZFS or on the native file system, I threw the native one in the mix, so let's poke at HFS, why not? It's sitting there, it's mounted, let's just try it. And where that was the most dramatically different is with NTFS. They're famous for caching the heck out of everything, so suddenly, yeah, looking good, looking good. Hyper-V picked up there, but now when we get into async and more real-world workloads, things were pretty competitive with the ZFS on Linux actually stepping way ahead, so kudos to that team. Nicely done. There's definitely some coverage that's not here. FIO is broken on some of those platforms. Illumos specifically, Solaris, Debian ironically, and I think earlier had NetBSD UFS in the mix, but that's not super exciting. Now, if you really want to get to what can be for some a real-world workload of a very small size of data, wow, the RAM is doing great. We've got really good throughput. It's heavily cached, but we're all, oh, those are the highlights. We're looking great. So in the real world, as Alan's just wrapped up his talk on caching, yes, there are countless opportunities to cache in arguably tiering, and now with all these new flash devices coming online, be it NVMe, NM2, you name it, that's a whole different conversation to have. My concern is to disable the caching, disable whatever, and look at how the OS is handling these internal operations as opposed to how to get the most performance out of your database, etc. Different conversations. So known issues. ZFS on Windows is very much still in alpha. At about 2 a.m. I confirmed that a send operation might take down a whole host OS, and it wouldn't even recover from a recovery partition. And maybe it was some fluke. I don't know. It'll be interesting to chase down. But boom, you can see the tweet of some of the blue screens on that. So again, the macOS performance curve, having a lab is very helpful for just predictably and iterating through different steps. And virtual machines are great, but wow, that's not the place to try and do that because you never know who's caching. The OS, the virtual machine, something in between, so hardware is important. In the long term, are we there yet? What are the metrics of being there yet? So one very clear one is root on ZFS. FreeBSD has done this very well for a very long time, where the installer says, hey, I think Alan, do we have you and Devin to thank? Would you like to use UFS? Would you like to use ZFS? In this case, ZFS, to install your OS with basic parameters that you may want to adjust. There are always more, but it's overall been treating me very well, and I've been using that myself for years. Naturally, Solaris and Illumos pioneered that. That's where the whole concept began in boot environments and all those wonderful things. Again, Proxmox pulls it off here and now. If you want to just spin up a Linux distribution that has, you can throw packages at and do some testing with, that's the one, ironically, I'm guessing a really large EFI partition with lots of goodies, more so than a proper enlightened loader, but that's okay. The effect is there. And again, Ubuntu is promising it very soon. They are apparently taking the lead on that, and go for it. We're all audience members, especially as BSD members, community members. So, also, in the wild, people do like ZFS and like to hand it off to ESXi, like to hand it off to just about anywhere they can. FreeNAS and Windows and iSCSI are a very good combination. FreeNAS hosts that extremely well, and Windows is remarkably tolerant. It will suffer reboots of the iSCSI system. It will just patiently wait and pick up where it left off, and it's rather robust. It's very impressive. Congratulations, Mav, on his key work on the CTL framework to make all that magic happen. But here and now, spinning up these platforms, you can bolt on OpenZFS. It's a package away on Windows with next finish, and CentOS, package add, Debian, Ubuntu. XCPNG, the XenServer folks. I know of some who are quite happy with a combination of XenServer and FreeNAS. Well, having OpenZFS within reach is compelling. There's a Xential small office server, Swiss Army knife of an AD server and other friends. And it's quite good, and it's actually what I use for the AD source in some of the FreeNAS training. It just works, it's great, and more. So, also exciting, boot environments. I trust everyone's familiar with boot environments. The fact that you can even contain an entire different version of your OS in a different data set. And if your bootloader's enlightened enough, it'll say, yes, I know him and her and all these different ones. I will boot whatever. With all these different OSs that are struggling slowly to achieve root on ZFS, we may have a moment where you choose a different OS off the same Z pool, be it Windows or FreeBSD or Illumos. And I would love to see that happen. And related to that is the Plan 9 9PFS, which is somewhere between NFS and a block device, and it's a bootable file-level device, such that if you have a future host with different OSs and boot environments, you pass those off at the file level to a hypervisor, and magical things should happen. There was a bit of a preview of that in FreeNAS 10 Corral, and the Beehive team is looking at hopefully incorporating the 9PFS work that came out of some of that, and Juniper's working on that. Thank you, Steve and company. So that's part of what I think the future looks like. And for another litmus test, are we there yet? All of this is actual output, slightly trimmed from the lab. And I started safe, sending a simple random data image snapshot from FreeNAS to ZFS on Linux on FreeBSD. And I send it over, and I list, and behold, there it is. I send it from there to FreeBSD ARM64. There it is. I ship it over to OmniOS CE, which is naturally a very ZFS-friendly OS, and it made it, no problem. I've got my 1 gig random data over there. I ship it from OmniOS to CentOS, no problem at all over SSH, just in this case in the lab, wide open keys, so I can just do anything anywhere and just say, here, take this. And finally, off to Debian. And finally, I believe this discussion ends shortly. NetBSD, no problem. It's an early platform, but no problem receiving it. And finally, to macOS. And I've been doing send and receive on a Mac for nearly a decade, and that's been treating me well. And no problem. But the caveat is no luck at this very moment on the Windows platforms. Jorgen and I identified the problem late last night, and there may be some stability issues, but that's definitely something to work on. But that baton went a long way between all these platforms, and that's what cross-platform abilities look like. And if you're thinking, oh, what will this do to FreeNAS? Well, suddenly, if these are all equal players, there are countless opportunities, especially in a diverse environment where you're maintaining different OSs. And it's like, yes, we back up our Windows system to a NetBSD system to a you name it, because you can, notably probably Linux, but hey, it's in the mix. Wish list, okay, so like TCP/IP, there is at some level a defined standard of the on-disk format of ZFS. I don't know if there are vendors who would say, hey, what would, say, an embedded version look like for mobile devices, for in-car devices, you name it, that has more flexible licensing, that is probably flash-oriented in this day and age. Nothing fancy like RAID Z, maybe mirroring because it's a rather simple strategy, and maybe real simple caching, not the sophisticated caching that Alan kindly elaborated on. So that's fascinating, and the push for such a thing will increase once we have universal OpenZFS on desktop and server OSs, and I'm trying to get us there. So, because at all points we have a job to do. We're here probably with the boss who sent us here and wants us to learn things and come back with opportunities to make life easier back at the office. So, about that, someone confronted me in the hallway, like, so about that tweet, you said like OpenBSD, and it's like, yes, we all know that they would never, ever, ever have in-base OpenZFS for licensing and spiritual reasons, and you name it, and I totally respect that. That's awesome. But there are some very kind folks running businesses out there who trust their packets to OpenBSD, and they sleep better at night doing that. And they trust their data to OpenZFS on other platforms, and they do it day and night, and it's just non-negotiable. Those are the best tools available for those two realms. Granted, other BSDs do networking extremely well, but they have chosen those. They're familiar with them. They like the philosophies. So users want that. VMware, wow, all this stacking of ZFS and a block device and VMFS and then maybe a VM with ZFS. It's like, well, let's cut out some of those middle layers such that I'd hope the VMware plug-in architecture would allow for an additional file system. Will it happen anytime soon? I don't know, but that's what users want. And about that, getting a job done, professional environments. A client pointed out that at his investment firm, like, why the heck do the Windows Pro workstations have Candy Crush friends on every workstation? And if you give a tour and you accidentally touch the Windows key, which now has like a store, pop up in your face, it's Candy Crush. And it's like, is that professional? And we like to say, oh, the open source community isn't that professional. It's like, no, that's not professional. That's not cool. Please don't do that. That's, no. So I touched on Hyper-V Core earlier. Hyper-V Core is out there to compete with Zen Server and ESXi basic version that you don't pay for because they realize, well, people are giving it away for free, so we should give it away for free too. And it boots up to a shell, a bit like FreeNAS, where it gives you numbered options, add a user, enable remote access, restart the system, and like 14 options that are just really straightforward. Hiding behind that is a command.com shell that can be switched to a PowerShell shell, and nothing else. And to that, one can add OpenZFS, one can add Windows Admin Center, one can add Chrome, the browser. It pops up, there's enough graphics handling to pop up and say next, 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 finish, and then it vanishes. And you suddenly get a system that's headless with an HTML5 interface that has a PowerShell through the web interface that doesn't require RSAT, that doesn't require all these tools that I'm so happy to not have to learn the moment I learned about them because they're now web-based tools that bolt onto it. You may recall from a few years ago the Swan desktop for Windows, which is Cygwin plus XFCE, and I think it just needs some path adjustments such that this could suddenly have ZFS, XFCE, a hypervisor, and basically be the presentation laptop I've used the last 5 years or more. So that's a compelling one, and it's all free of charge. And so what does this get a job done ecosystem look like in 2019? You have, in this case, the Hyper-V tab open, the IPMI tab, now that vendors realize that people really don't want a Java client that only runs in Windows 7 to manage a fan speed that you should crank up during the summer on those drives. And the pfSense tab, the FreeNAS tab, I see a lot of those in my work. The ESXi tab, which now has out of the box a nice HTML5 interface that does most things. It's not perfect, but wow, it's a lot better than it was. The Proxmox tab, the Zenshell tab, and you name it. That's what this is all looking like, and it's increasingly on OpenZFS, such that behind the scenes, you can replicate one-to-one, you name it wherever you please, happily, and know that your data is safe and that things like ransomware are not going to gobble up any of those systems, that suddenly the tab's not responding because, oh wow, it's offline. I will be seeing some of you certainly at the upcoming OpenZFS Developer Summit in San Francisco. That is a great event if you are into OpenZFS and its lowest level plumbing and have questions that, can be answered by the people who wrote the core algorithms that became the code that became OpenZFS as we know it. Jorgen, who's done the macOS and Windows work, and I will be talking about OpenZFS portability. Him from a code perspective, me from a lab perspective, and that should be fun. Very special thanks to Jorgen for his daring work on macOS and Windows. I've been relying on one of the two for a very long time, and I hear there are Windows users out there. I bump into them occasionally. That's an exciting opportunity for these technologies. Connor, who's in the room and will be speaking, and Jason have been very helpful on Windows things for a non-Windows user. I am learning as much PowerShell as I need to because, yeah, it's clever, but it's a decade or two late. I'm glad that they finally worked out an ecosystem that keeps various users happy, and that's great, but it's just not the one I grew up with. And thank you, VeriSign, Dan, and the team for making this event possible. We do have some time for questions, and I thank you. Questions? And what would you like explored in a lab? Because it is always the tip of the iceberg. Yes? The question is, what is the ARM64 hardware? Let me hop back to that slide. It is, I included the CPU name, just one sec. It is the A57, 64-bit. It's very PC-like. It takes 2 drives, 2 SATA ports. That shiny thing is the power button. It'll take you about half an hour to figure that out. The case is a bit commodity, but it's missing a PCIe slot. That would be very interesting. And there's like the Rock Pro 64, which has a PCIe slot. That's getting exciting because I was hoping to have the Rock Pro represented here and that and the Macchiato bin or Banana Pi, which has a SATA connector directly on the motherboard. Just off you go. Because I think we all have a right to ZFS in little secure locations that's perhaps PoE powered and you name it. Other questions, experiences, ideas? Colin. Yeah, I did check some. It's along for the ride in the data set, and it survived. But yes, that's a very key point. And what will be curious is where might there be opportunities for failing that? But yes, very good point.
Yeah, where'd you go get the
In bulk. eBay and Craigslist are your friend. It's as simple as that. I do have a source for some more 220s who didn't like to pay the eBay fees, so it's like, oh, by the way, can you just talk on the side, and it was great. But yes, and depending on where you are, talk to local engineering firms, and the city of Milwaukee, Oregon, where the 420s came from, later did I know someone bought a pallet of them at auction, very cheap, and I got them cheapish. So yeah, they're your friend. I saw a hand in back. Yes, Paul. I haven't gotten that far. Nope. The question is, am I using mmap in addition to read and write? It's strictly read and write at this point. It's a litmus test. I hope that isn't a source of pain and suffering on the variety of OSs, because even FiO will throw issues with ODirect and other friends, and I'm very much welcoming input on that. I wanted to get to, okay, are we all on the same page? I started out with Passmark. It's a very Windows gamer-oriented benchmark, just to make sure that all the machines act similarly. Maybe one had a different CPU, a different, you name it. The RAM wasn't different. The one variation I have is that the RAM modules are all vendor compliant, but they are slightly different models. I'd love to have a budget to bring them all up to more RAM and with identical modules getting there. The fact that something like Passmark is executing while Windows is doing all its stuff is a bit terrifying. So I'm surprised how few benchmarking suites are out there that are very single user oriented without noise in the background, and maybe Phoronix Test Suite, I don't know, please advise. But I'm open to ideas there. And if you want something thrown at it, great, let me know, because there are a million opportunities and thousands of knobs to turn. So, other questions? Who's not using ZFS? I saw hands go up for Alan's talk. Okay, we've got to. And I totally get enough file system to load your PF rule set. I get that. That's awesome. I get it. I appreciate that. And there are embedded options galore. But when, for example, you're logging all that comes out of that device, you generally want the ecosystem and flexibility of something like ZFS. And I've got articles out there on the risks of an ecosystem. I'd love more opportunities of other file systems that can take it on, but we're still at a point where ButterFS is not quite there yet, and Bcache-FS is one of the most promising, and it might make it in the Linux kernel next, and I'll bring it into the lab. Great, may the best file system win. I don't have a particular pony in this race, but we all have jobs to do. And thank you. You can corner me in the hallway. And again, thank you, Verisign.